So the first story that I want to talk about this week, John Tortorella, he's no longer coaching in the NHL. Now I believe that he's an analyst. I believe it is for NBC or possibly for TNT. Anybody who cares to can correct me on that. But in either case, John Tortorella recently had some comments about Connor McDavid that had a lot of Edmonton Oilers fans big mad. And I do understand why. I mean, we all love Connor McDavid. He's the best hockey player in the entire world, and he's all ours. At least until for the duration of this contract, he is all ours. And Edmonton Oilers fans, they don't really like to hear a whole lot of negative things about Connor McDavid. And really, for the most part, what's not to love? And so, to be more specific, what John Tortorella had to say was basically he was talking about some of the comments that have recently been made about Connor McDavid's seeming inability to draw a penalty, despite the fact that, you just watch when he's on the ice, you watch what the other teams do, and to put it the absolute least, they're not very nice to Connor. There are all kinds of penalties on Connor that go uncalled, for no good reason, and the NHL really ought to be doing something about it. And even the Boston Bruins coaching staff all seem to agree that there was no reason why there shouldn't have been a few more penalty calls, penalties drawn by Connor McDavid when they played last week. So even despite all of that, John Tortorella, he basically had one thing to say about it, and that was that he wanted to say, hey Connor, grow up, stop complaining. He has to change his game anyway, or so John Tortorella thinks. He seems to think that there are all sorts of ways that Connor McDavid needs to get better to succeed in the league as a whole anyway. And while it is pretty obvious that he's entirely wrong about the penalty issue, the NHL should protect its stars from injury, so it should call those penalties and make sure that those slashes and all of those those slashes, those trips, all of those things that can contribute to injuries, so that they're not happening to their biggest star nearly so much as they are. So yeah, John Tortorella is wrong about that in particular, but I'll tell you one thing that John Tortorella, he's not wrong about everything that he said. He's not wrong about everything that he said. He's not wrong when he says that Connor McDavid does need to find some ways to change and improve his game, and the one person who seems to agree with that most of all is Connor McDavid himself. And how do we see that? Well, we see, quite frankly, it in the way that he continually improves his game every single year so far. It seems like every single year that Connor McDavid has been in this league, we have seen a new version of Connor McDavid, a different version than the previous season. And if you want evidence of that, all you need to do is look at how quickly he has reached each of the 100-point increments, in his stat sheet that he's reached so far. He seems to reach his next 100 points. Well, actually, there's no seems to about it. He reaches his next 100 points faster than the previous one. And that obviously tells you a lot about Connor McDavid, but it doesn't just tell you about what kind of hockey player he is. It also tells you about the psychology of the kind of player that he is. You would actually think, I think it would be pretty safe to presume that most people, if they were the best hockey player in the world, most people would probably think to themselves, I'm the best there is. There isn't really much need for me to get any better. And yet Connor McDavid goes out, works his ass off every offseason, comes back, and each season he is better than what he was the season before. And that defies expectations in so many ways, but really the biggest one is this, is actually it tells you a lot about exactly who Connor McDavid is as a person. And the biggest thing that it tells you is this. He defies expectation in one very big and important way, and that is that you would think that the best person at one particular thing in the world would feel like they probably have some license, to get a little bit narcissistic. And Connor McDavid, the absolute last thing that Connor McDavid is narcissistic. If he were a narcissist, he would not work nearly so hard as he does every single offseason to be better than he was the previous season. That's because, psychologically speaking, narcissists, they have kind of a tendency to see the world in a different way than a lot of other people do. Narcissists, they have this tendency to kind of see the world from the outside in. And so what that means is that narcissists, they have a tendency to look at whatever it is in their life that they might be involved in, and they expect certain things of that for their own validation, their own edification. They look at everything in their life as something that they're supposed to use to validate themselves. Or they tend to be obsessed with the amount of control that they can exert over other people. And their biggest tendency is to be takers rather than to be givers. And there is a lot to be said about whether a professional athlete is best served to be a giver or whether they're best served to be a taker. That's something that I'm going to leave for a later video. Right now, what I'm going to address is the way that he gives so much of himself to try to make the players around him better. And that his means of trying to control a game, they're not by trying to control the people inside the game. It's literally by just going out and doing what he can do as a player, just giving 100% of everything that he has, every single game, exactly the way that Walter Gretzky taught Wayne Gretzky. I mean, psychologically speaking, Connor McDavid followed a different path than, say, Josh Hosang. There are a lot of people out there who actually still do believe that Josh Hosang was, in terms of raw talent, a better player than Connor McDavid was. And that really the biggest difference between the two is what Connor McDavid and Josh Hosang have done with their talents. But I think that one of the biggest things that they did differently was that Josh Hosang, when you look at, in particular, his early career, there was a lot of tendency towards narcissism. There was things like, for example, he would go out and he would throw a tantrum and he would freak out on the referees if he didn't get a penalty that he should have gotten, and that was a pretty routine thing for Josh Hosang. It's actually been a pretty rare thing for Connor McDavid, although he has done it a time or two. Now, Josh Hosang has turned away from that a little bit in recent years. He's actually turned to a much less narcissistic psychological path through his hockey career, and you can actually see the immediate dividends that has played. I mean, he's not back in the NHL with the Toronto Maple Leafs yet, but he is on his way back to the NHL. He's currently with the Toronto Marlies. But I do think that's a reasonable question to ask, that if Josh Hosang had turned over this newer, non-narcissistic Leaf a lot earlier in his career, I mean, all the way back when he was in the juniors, would we all be thinking of Connor McDavid as the best player in the world today? That is a fair question. But let's for one moment turn this back to John Tortorella again, re-examine the things that he said about Connor McDavid, and figure out exactly what it is that he's right about more specifically. And it came down to this one particular detail where he basically came out and said, hey, you can't go to the playoffs and expect to win just by filling the net. It doesn't work that way. And interestingly enough, as many of the fans that are angry at John Tortorella because he said this, who else has actually said this? Connor McDavid has said this. He's actually talked about wanting to be one of these players that are more defensively responsible, still able to score at will. He's still working very hard to bring these two parts of his game together, but as we saw in the playoffs last year against Winnipeg, Connor McDavid's scoring is not enough for this team to win in the playoffs. Better defensive play from everybody that's on that team would have served the Oilers pretty well in terms of getting them through that first round, or at the very least not getting swept. And the first person that would actually come forward and say that would be Connor McDavid. So was John Tortorella wrong about the penalties thing? Yeah, absolutely, and that's not even a question. But was he wrong about the need for Connor McDavid to add more things to his game? Well, no, absolutely not. I don't think that he actually was wrong about that. And like I said before, Connor McDavid would be the first person to tell you so.